Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to tackle those really big foundational ideas from philosophy and politics and, well, give you the essential takeaways without you having to wade through hundreds of pages.
That's the plan.
Today, we're zeroing in on a concept that's absolutely central to how we think about modern society.
Liberty.
Liberty. It really is this fundamental kind of constant negotiation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Between what an individual wants their autonomy and what the group or society or the state demands. That collective authority.
Feels like a debate that never truly ends because the context is always changing.
Exactly. And our main guide for this particular deep dive is John Stuart Mill's really groundbreaking 1859 essay on liberty. It's a cornerstone text.
Right. So we're not just doing a book report here.
No, definitely not.
Yeah.
The aim is to really pull out the core arguments, the insights Mill offered, that still shape how we think about, well, when is it okay for the government to step in? And maybe even more importantly today, how do we make sure minority views or unconventional lifestyles aren't just stamped out by social pressure? That protection for minority voices feels incredibly relevant. Now, we should mention something about how we're putting this analysis together for you.
Yes. It's worth noting up front, you are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's NotebookLM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
We're leveraging this tech to synthesize Mill's arguments quickly and accurately. It lets us cut through some of the density and get straight to the heart of his ideas on liberty.
Which is important because, as you said, liberty isn't just another political buzzword. It's crucial to understand right from the beginning why Mill and many others see liberty as, well, a sovereign organizing principle.
Sovereign. What do you mean by that exactly? More than just freedom.
Yeah, it means it kind of governs the relationship between all the other big political concepts we talk about: democracy, justice, equality, authority itself. Think about it. If our understanding of what constitutes legitimate individual freedom is flawed, then our judgments about everything else get skewed.
Okay, I see. So if you get liberty wrong.
You get governance wrong. Pretty much. Misunderstand the proper scope of liberty, and suddenly your ideas about fair laws or just social structures or even what democracy means become contaminated.
So it has a kind of hierarchy. Liberty comes first.
In a sense, yes. It sets the ground rules. It determines the legitimate scope of democratic decision-making. Democracy isn't absolute. Liberty draws the line saying, okay, majority rule stops here. It defines the boundaries of legal authority. And importantly, it carves out that private space, you could call it a sanctuary for individual conscience, for thought, for lifestyle, where the state and even overwhelming social opinion shouldn't tread.
It's like a protective fence around the individual.
A fence, yes, but also, crucially, the fertile ground needed for individuals to actually grow and develop fully. It's both protective and enabling.
Right, that sets a pretty high bar for understanding liberty. To really appreciate Mill's contribution, maybe we should trace how the idea itself developed before him.
Good idea. Context is key here. Mill didn't invent the concept out of thin air. If you go way back to ancient Greece and Rome, their idea of liberty was quite different from ours.
It was more political, less personal.
Exactly. For the classical world, liberty primarily meant protection from tyranny. Freedom from the arbitrary rule of a despot, a king who could do whatever he wanted. It wasn't so much about the individual's right to, say, live an eccentric life in private.
It was about having a say in how things were run.
Precisely. It was about political liberty, the citizen's right, and even duty to participate in governing the city-state, the polis, or the Roman Republic. Collective self-governance. Freedom was achieved through active participation in the state, not necessarily against it.
Okay, so that's the ancient view. Then things shifted quite dramatically, especially in the early modern period, with figures like John Locke.
Right. Locke's second treatise of government, published around 1690, was revolutionary. He took liberty out of the realm of just political custom and grounded it in natural law.
Meaning it's inherent, not granted by rulers.
Yes. Liberty wasn't something a king gave you. It was a right you possessed naturally as a human being. Locke's famous definition frames it as the right to dispose and order as he lists his person, actions, possessions, and his whole property. Basically, control over yourself and your stuff.
But there's always a but, isn't there? Locke didn't advocate for anarchy.
Not at all. The crucial qualifier in Locke's definition is that this natural liberty exists only within the allowance of those laws under which he is. So it's ordered freedom. It's freedom within a system of just laws created by a government established by consent.
So Locke's main target was the absolute monarch, the arbitrary king. He was establishing rights against that kind of power, but within a framework of law.
That's the core of it. He provided the philosophical justification for constitutional limits on monarchy. But once that battle was, well, largely won in places like Britain and America, once constitutional checks were more established by the 19th century, the nature of the threat to liberty began to change.
And this is where Mill comes in.
This is precisely where Mill makes his unique and crucial contribution. If Locke and thinkers like Montesquieu dealt with the problem of political tyranny, the tyranny of the one or the few, Mill identified a new, more subtle danger that arose directly from the success of democratic ideas.
The danger came from the people themselves.
Exactly. Once you have mass democracy, where the government supposedly represents the will of the majority, the government itself isn't automatically the main enemy of freedom anymore. The new threat Mill saw was the collective, the majority.
So on liberty isn't just about limiting kings, it's about limiting us, the majority.
That's the watershed moment. Mill shifted the whole debate. The question was no longer just how do we control the king? It became how do we limit the power of the sovereign people over the individual? He started asking these really fundamental questions that are still central today. Where does society's legitimate authority end? What justifies any intervention, even by a democratically elected government, into an individual's life?
It's a shift from worrying about concentrated power in one person's hands to worrying about this diffuse, almost atmospheric pressure from the group.
Perfectly put. Mill recognized that a democratic majority, armed with the legitimacy of popular consent, could impose a kind of moral and social despotism over minorities and nonconformists. And this social tyranny could be far more pervasive, penetrating much deeper into the details of life than any old-fashioned political tyranny.
Because it's not just laws, it's customs, opinions, stigma.
It's the pressure to conform, the tyranny of prevailing opinion and feeling, as he put it. That became Mill's primary concern.
Which brings us squarely to this core concept, the tyranny of the majority. It's probably Mill's most famous contribution to political thought. We tend to think democracy equals freedom, but Mill's point was, well, more complicated.
Much more complicated. He saw that democracy, while preferable to despotism, created its own unique threat to liberty. It's subtle because it doesn't always rely on force or explicit laws.
How does it operate then?
It works through social pressure, through the sheer weight of majority opinion. When most people believe something strongly or live a certain way, they can make life very difficult for those who dissent or differ. Think about social stigma, being ostracized, maybe even economic consequences for holding unpopular views or living an unconventional life.
So just having democratic institutions, elections, parliaments isn't enough to guarantee real, meaningful freedom for everyone, especially minorities or dissenters.
Absolutely not. You need specific protections against the potential overreach of the democratic majority itself. This led Mill to grapple with that core tension. How do you balance the need for some level of social order and cohesion with the absolute necessity of individual autonomy and diversity?
And his proposed solution, his attempt to draw a clear line, is the famous harm principle.
Yes, the harm principle is Mill's attempt at a relatively simple, clear rule. He states it quite powerfully. The sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection.
Okay, break that down. What does it mean in practice?
It means that the only justification for restricting someone's freedom, whether by law or social pressure, is to prevent them from harming other people. If your actions only affect yourself or only affect other consenting adults, then society, according to Mill, has no right to interfere, no matter how foolish, wrong, or even immoral others might find your actions.
Harm seems like the key word there, and potentially a tricky one.
Extremely tricky. That's the elegance and the enduring difficulty of the harm principle. Mill primarily meant direct, tangible harm, physical injury, damage to property, violating someone's specific rights through force or fraud, things you could point to.
But what about less direct things? What if my lifestyle choices, say, deeply offend my neighbor's religious beliefs? Does their offense count as harm under Mill's principle?
Mill was absolutely adamant on this point. No. Moral offense, disgust, dislike, none of that qualifies as harm in the sense that justifies coercion. He explicitly argued against suppressing actions simply because they offend the sensibilities of the majority.
Why was he so strong on that?
Because if you allowed mere offense to count as harm, the tyranny of the majority would immediately crush all individuality. Any unconventional opinion or lifestyle could be banned simply because it upsets someone. For Mill, the law's purpose isn't to enforce the majority's morality or protect people from feeling offended. It's to protect people from concrete injury inflicted by others.
So the state can't save you from yourself, nor can it shield others from being offended by your self-regarding choices.
That's the essence of it for Millam. Now, this raises the question of indirect harm, doesn't it?
Right. What if my choices, while primarily affecting me, have knock-on effects? Like if I refuse to work and become reliant on public assistance, haven't I indirectly harmed the taxpayers? Or if my unhealthy habits strain the healthcare system?
This is where Mill's utilitarian background comes into play, and it gets more nuanced. He acknowledged that purely self-regarding actions can have negative consequences for society. His distinction was between actions that cause definite harm to specific individuals, violating their rights, and actions that merely cause a general detriment to society or fail to contribute positively.
So where did he draw the line for intervention?
Compulsion, meaning legal punishment or state interference, was reserved only for actions causing direct, assignable harm to others. For behavior that was merely self-destructive or non-beneficial, Mill argued society could use persuasion, argument, social disapproval, even avoidance, but not force. The indirect social costs of some self-regarding behavior were, for him, a price worth paying for the greater good of individual liberty.
It sounds like interpreting and applying the harm principle in real legal cases must be a constant challenge.
It absolutely is. It's arguably the philosophical bedrock of much of modern Western law regarding individual rights. Think about constitutional systems, especially things like the Bill of Rights in the U.S. or similar charters elsewhere. They essentially embody Mill's concern protecting individuals from potential majority overreach.
Can you give an example of how courts wrestle with this?
Sure. Take free speech cases. Courts are constantly dealing with laws or regulations that try to restrict speech deemed offensive, hateful, or harmful. A court applying a Millian framework has to ask, does this speech cross the line into inciting immediate violence or constitute defamation, direct demonstrable harm? Or is it primarily causing offense, however profound?
And if it's just offense?
Then, typically, following Mill, the court would rule against the restriction, affirming that even deeply unpopular or offensive speech is protected unless it meets that high bar of direct harm. Similar debates happen around issues of personal autonomy, medical decisions, lifestyle choices, religious practices. The core question is always, is there a legitimate harm to an unconsenting third party that justifies restricting the individual's liberty?
Okay, so the harm principle sets the limit on interference.
Yeah.
But Mill also talked about the positive side, right? What freedoms must a society actively protect?
Yes, he wasn't just about limitations. He outlined 3 absolutely essential categories of liberty that any society aiming to be considered free must guarantee. These are non-negotiable for human flourishing.
What's the first one?
The absolute cornerstone is number 1, freedom of thought and opinion. This includes the freedom to hold any belief, to express it, and crucially, to discuss it openly, no matter how unpopular or even seemingly false it might be.
He famously argued that silencing even one dissenting opinion is wrong. Why was that so vital for him, even if the opinion is clearly mistaken?
Mill gives 2 incredibly powerful reasons, often called his dead dogma argument. First, the silenced opinion, however much we disagree with it, might actually be true, or partially true. Since we're all fallible, the dominant opinion could be wrong, and silencing dissent prevents us from potentially discovering the truth or correcting our errors.
Okay, that makes sense. What's the second reason?
Second, and this is perhaps even more profound, even if the prevailing opinion is the whole truth, if it's not constantly and vigorously challenged, people won't understand why it's true. They'll hold it simply as a prejudice, a dead dogma, without grasping its rational foundations or feeling its real meaning.
So truth needs opposition to stay alive and meaningful.
Exactly. The intellectual struggle, the need to defend your beliefs against criticism, is what keeps understanding deep and vital. Without that challenge, truth loses its power over conduct and character. It's a brilliant defense not just of tolerance, but of the necessity of dissent for intellectual health.
That's a very strong argument. What's the second essential freedom?
Number 2 is the freedom of tastes and pursuits. This is the liberty to frame your own plan of life, to choose your own path, your career, your lifestyle, your relationships, based on your own character and values, provided, of course, you don't harm others in doing so.
This sounds like his defense of individuality, of nonconformity.
Precisely. Mill championed experiments in living. He believed human beings are diverse, and what brings happiness or fulfillment to one person might be entirely different for another. A society that allows and even encourages a wide variety of lifestyles is more vibrant, more progressive, and ultimately better for human development than one that tries to force everyone into the same mold dictated by custom or majority preference.
And the third freedom.
Number 3 is the freedom of association. This is the right for individuals to unite with others for any common purpose that doesn't involve harm, forming clubs, political parties, religious groups, unions, any kind of voluntary association.
Why is this one so important?
Because it allows individuals to combine their strengths, pursue shared goals, and develop collective power. This is essential for social movements, for civil society, and it acts as another crucial check on the potential overreach of both the state and homogeneous public opinion. These 3 freedoms, together thought, pursuits, and association, form the bedrock of a genuinely free society for Mill.
Okay, those are the core freedoms to protect. Now, Mill also gave specific reasons why we should object to government interference, even when it's supposedly trying to help or be efficient, right? Beyond just the harm principle.
Yes, he offered a framework for limiting state power, outlining 3 main grounds for resisting government intervention, even in areas where direct harm isn't the primary issue.
These seem important for understanding the limits of, say, bureaucracy or government programs. What's the first ground?
The first is competence. This is the most straightforward, practical argument. Sometimes individuals or voluntary groups are simply better at doing certain things than government agencies are. They might have more local knowledge, be more flexible, or more motivated.
So this supports things like free markets or community initiatives over state control based on effectiveness.
Essentially, yes. It's a utilitarian argument. Let the entity best suited for the task do it. If the government is likely to bungle it or be less efficient, let individuals or associations handle it.
Makes sense. What's the second ground for objecting?
The second ground is development, and this one goes much deeper than just efficiency. This is really at the philosophical heart of On Liberty. Mill argues that even if the government could theoretically do something more efficiently or achieve a better outcome, it's often better for the individual's own development to do it themselves, or collectively through voluntary association.
Wait, so choosing for yourself, even if you mess up, is intrinsically valuable. More valuable than the state getting it right for you.
That's exactly the point, and it's a powerful one. Mill believed liberty is essential for human development. The very act of choosing, planning, taking responsibility, making mistakes, and learning from them this process is what cultivates our faculties, strengthens our character, and makes us active, engaged human beings.
So a government that steps in too much, even with good intentions, can actually stunt our growth as individuals.
Precisely. If the government takes over responsibilities that people could manage themselves, it treats them like children. It might achieve a neat, orderly result, but it does so at the cost of the moral and intellectual development of the citizens themselves. That's a trade-off Mill was unwilling to make. Liberty's value goes beyond just getting the right outcome. It's about the process of becoming a self-governing person.
That's a crucial distinction. It really highlights his focus on the individual.
It absolutely does. It shows he wasn't just a utilitarian calculating aggregate happiness. He deeply valued the flourishing of the individual spirit.
Okay, before we get to the third reason to limit government and then look at how these ideas play out today, let's quickly mention our YouTube channel.
Good idea. We want to remind you about Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel where we offer AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought digging into complex works like Mill's On Liberty. Check it out.
Definitely worth a look.
Okay.
So we had competence and development as reasons to limit state power. What was Mill's third ground?
The third ground is power concentration. This is a more political, prudential argument. Mill warned against allowing the government to accumulate too much power by controlling too many aspects of life, education, major industries, welfare, etc.
Why was that inherently dangerous, even if the government was competent and didn't stifle development?
Because excessive concentration of power, even in theoretically benevolent hands, is itself a threat to liberty. It creates a dependency on the state, stifles private initiative and diversity of thought, and risks creating a massive, unresponsive bureaucracy. Eventually, such a concentration of power could become tyrannical simply because it's so pervasive and hard to challenge.
So it's about preventing the state from becoming this overwhelming, inescapable force in society.
Exactly. It's a practical check against potential future oppression and stagnation. Keep power dispersed, encourage independent centers of activity, and thought that was Mill's advice. So the 3 objections are: the state might be bad at it, competence; doing it ourselves is better for us, development; and giving the state too much control is dangerous, power concentration.
That's a very clear framework. Now, Mill wrote this in the mid-19th century. How have these ideas about liberty evolved or been challenged since then?
Well, the core ideas remain central, but the 20th century added some important layers and distinctions. One of the most influential came about a century after Mill.
You must be talking about Isaiah Berlin and his famous essay, Two Concepts of Liberty from 1958.
Precisely. Berlin made a crucial distinction that helps clarify a lot of modern political debates. He separated liberty into negative liberty and positive liberty.
Okay, what's the difference? Negative liberty sounds, well,
Negative liberty is essentially the classical liberal million concept, freedom from. Freedom from interference, from external constraints, from coercion by others, especially the state. It's about carving out a sphere where you are left alone. Think of rights like freedom of speech, freedom from arbitrary arrest. These are fundamentally about preventing interference.
all right, freedom from, so what's positive liberty? Freedom too.
Exactly. Positive liberty is about having the actual capacity or power to act, to be your own master, to achieve self-realization. It's not just about the absence of external barriers, but about possessing the internal capacities and external resources needed to pursue meaningful goals.
Can you give an example of how that plays out differently?
Sure. Take education. A negative liberty perspective might say freedom means the government can't stop you from getting educated or tell you what to learn. A positive liberty perspective might argue that true freedom requires the government to provide education, ensuring everyone has the actual capacity and opportunity to learn and develop their potential, even if they can't afford it themselves.
So positive liberty can sometimes justify government action providing resources, removing internal obstacles like poverty or lack of education in the name of enhancing real freedom.
That's the core idea and also the source of much debate. Critics worry that the pursuit of positive liberty can lead to excessive state intervention, potentially even justifying paternalism or authoritarianism in the name of helping people achieve their true selves. Berlin himself was wary of this.
So negative liberty emphasizes protection from the state, while positive liberty might sometimes require action by the state to enable genuine choice.
That's a good way to summarize the tension. And almost every major policy debate today, healthcare, welfare, economic regulation, involves clashes between these two conceptions of liberty. Both sides often claim the mantle of freedom.
Fascinating distinction. Now, how do Mill's original ideas, especially the harm principle and his concern about social tyranny, apply to challenges he couldn't possibly have foreseen, like the digital age?
It's incredibly relevant, actually. Think about digital surveillance, the power of big tech platforms, algorithmic decision-making. These raise fundamental questions about liberty in new contexts.
Like, does mass data collection by governments or corporations constitute a form of harm, even if no specific individual is immediately injured? Does it chill dissent?
That's a key question. Or consider platform governance when social media companies decide which content is allowed, promoted, or suppressed. Is this a new form of the tyranny of the majority, exercised not by the state, but by private companies controlling the main channels of public discourse?
And what about algorithms themselves? If algorithms subtly shape our news feeds, our purchasing decisions, even our political views, are they manipulating us in ways that undermine our freedom of thought and our ability to form our own tastes and pursuits, as Mill valued?
These are precisely the million questions we need to ask now. Does algorithmic bias constitute a harmful manipulation? How do we balance the benefits of these technologies with the potential threats to individual autonomy and conscious choice? Where does the legitimate authority of the platform end and the individual's freedom begin? Mill's framework forces us to confront whether these new forms of influence cross the line into illegitimate control.
It really does translate surprisingly well. What about on a global scale? How do these ideas about liberty interact with international relations and human rights?
Well, the development of international human rights law can be seen as an attempt to universalize some core million principles protecting basic individual freedoms from state overreach everywhere.
But that runs into challenges with cultural differences, doesn't it?
Absolutely. You see the same tension Mill grappled with playing out globally. How do you uphold universal principles of liberty, like freedom of conscience or equality, while respecting diverse cultural traditions and national sovereignty? Debates about cultural relativism versus universal rights, or about humanitarian intervention, often hinge on this conflict. When does a local custom become an unacceptable violation of fundamental liberty that warrants external criticism or even action?
It mirrors Mill's struggle,
Yep.
balancing individual rights against the claims of the collective, just on a much larger stage.
Precisely. The core dilemma endures.
So looking back at Mill's on liberty, Its significance seems clear. It's not just a historical document.
Not at all. Liberty, as Mill articulated it, functions in two key ways. It's a crucial limiting principle on power. It tells the state and society where they must stop. But it's also an enabling condition. It creates the necessary space for individuals to experiment, to develop, to flourish, which in turn benefits society through progress and innovation.
He saw individual freedom and social progress as linked, not opposed.
Deeply linked. He believed a society composed of diverse, independently thinking, actively engaged individuals would be far more dynamic, creative, and ultimately resilient than a society of conformists.
And when we look around today, the issues might be new pandemic restrictions, debates about economic fairness, digital privacy battles, but the core questions feel very Millian.
They really do. Every time we debate how much individual sacrifice is justified for the collective good, or where to draw the line between personal choice and public health, or how to regulate new technologies without stifling freedom, we're essentially wrestling with the same fundamental tension Mill identified. How do we protect individual conscience and autonomy while maintaining a cohesive, functioning society? When does collective benefit justify individual constraint, and based on what definition of harm? Mill didn't give final answers, but he gave us an indispensable framework for thinking about it rationally.
A framework that seems more necessary than ever.
Indeed. And perhaps to leave our listeners with something more to chew on, we could pose a couple of questions that push Mill's ideas into even more contemporary territory.
Go for it.
Okay, first, if we take Mill's harm principle seriously, that we can only restrict liberty to prevent harm to others, how should it apply to massive, slow-moving, collective harm problems like climate change? Individual actions like high consumption contribute incrementally, but the cumulative effect harms billions, especially future generations. Does the harm principle need updating to effectively address diffuse, long-term collective injuries?
That's a tough one. It challenges the focus on immediate, direct harm. What's the second question?
Second, thinking about the future. What does liberty, particularly freedom of thought and autonomous choice, mean in an age of increasingly sophisticated artificial intelligence? If AI systems can predict our behavior, subtly nudge our choices, and manage more and more of our lives through automated decision-making potentially better than we could ourselves, are we genuinely free? Even if we feel free, is our autonomy being eroded in ways Mill couldn't have imagined?
Wow. Those are definitely questions that will require ongoing debate, pushing Mill's concepts into new frontiers.
They show that liberty isn't a settled concept. It remains this vital living principle, both a practical guide for how we structure society and govern ourselves, and a philosophical cornerstone for what it means to live a dignified human life.
It's a powerful legacy. Thanks for that deep dive.
My pleasure.
And for everyone listening, if you want to explore these ideas further, click the link on screen for the in-depth book summary, subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
And don't forget to see the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.